Well, let's jump in.
Well done, David.
Yes. Pam is she is a special one, y'all, and trust me, she would have been here tonight if she wasn't laid up. So let me pray for us. Gracious Father, we would ask tonight as we learn a little more about the life and thought of your servant C.S. Lewis, Lord, that more than being enraptured by the environs of Narnia, more than being taken and captivated by his labyrinthine intellect, Lord, that we would catch something of a desire for Sehnsucht, that we would desire the joy that can only come in Aslan, who is on the move among us, the Lord Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. The new house is almost a major character in my story, writes Lewis. I am a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs, indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles. Also of endless books. My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. He was a man after my own heart, actually. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests, books readable and unreadable, books suitable for a child, and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from shelves. I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me as a man who walks into a field has of finding a new blade of grass. Where all these books had been before we came to the new house is a problem that never occurred to me until I began writing this paragraph. I have no idea of the answer. A couple of things here deserve explanation. The new house that he's talking about here, where all these books were, is juxtaposed to the house in which C.S. Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898, and lived until April of 1905 at 47 Dundela Avenue in Belfast. That house has long since been replaced by a building of flats or apartments. I was born, he says, in the winter of 1898 at Belfast, the son of a solicitor and of a clergyman's daughter. So Lewis's paternal grandfather, Richard Lewis, was a Welsh boilermaker. He immigrated to Ireland in the 1850s, and Lewis would have grown up in the shadow of tension between Irish national Catholics who demanded home rule in Ireland and Protestant English immigrants into the Emerald Isle. Richard joined John McIlwain from McIlwain Lewis and Company. It's the firm that actually built the 1,608-ton ship, the Titanic, later to be surpassed by the 26,000-ton Titanic built by their competitor, Harland and Wolff. That ship infamously sank on its maiden voyage, as you know, in 1912. So Richard's son, Albert, had little interest in the family business. Instead, he wanted to become a solicitor as opposed to a barrister. A solicitor would help folks who needed representation find barristers, and the barristers would argue their cases in a courtroom. Albert married Florence Augusta Hamilton. Now, she was the daughter of a Protestant minister from the Church of Ireland. They married on August 29th, 1894 at St. Mark's Church in Dundela. Their first son, Warren Hamilton Lewis, Warnie, as we'll get to know him throughout these 5 weeks, was born June 16th, 1895. 3 years later, their second son, Clive Staples Lewis, was born. And at the old house in Dundela, the brothers were inseparable. Warren was called Arch Piggy Bottom, and Clive was called Small Piggy Bottom, because their nanny would always threaten to spank their piggy bottoms. Warney would later recall that sometime, it was either the summer of '04 or 1905, Clive came in and declared to the family that he was no longer to be called Clive, but instead he was to be called Jaxie. Jaxie. And then that was shortened to Jax, and then eventually it just became Jack. And we don't know exactly why he wanted to be called Jaxie, other than they had a dog named Jaxie. And so it would appear to be an homage to a dog that they had lost earlier in his life, that he wanted to become Jaxie, and that's why we know him as Jack. In fact, we have biographies that are entitled Jack, and that's the way he was known to his family from then on. Actually, his father continued to call him Jax, and that's going to come up later in a pretty telling statement. But his friends all knew him as Jack. He was a very precocious young child. He had read Milton's Paradise Lost by age 10. I mean, what were you doing by age 10? But he had read Milton's Paradise Lost by age 10. Very precocious. One day he came in and sat down in his father's study and announced to him, "Father, I have a prejudice against the French." And his father, Albert, asked him, "Well, why do you have a prejudice? Why do you have a prejudice against the French?" And Jaxie replied, "Well, if I knew, it wouldn't be a prejudice now, would it?" He was a very, very precocious young man. We're gonna discover that the brilliance of Lewis is seen across a wide genre, variegated literature. April 1905, Albert moved his family to the more spacious accommodations on the edge of Belfast, to the Libro House, or Littleley, as it affectionately became known. Now, this house is going to figure prominently in many ways why we're here tonight, because it's this house that in many ways shaped Lewis. Here, Warney and Jack spent endless hours together roaming the capacious new house, crawling in and out of an old, want to guess? Wardrobe. Yeah, crawling in and out of an old wardrobe, letting their imaginations take them to places where they would craft stories about animal land. Jack's land was called India. Warney was called India, and Jack created his own animals and so forth. They later merged their creative worlds into the land of Boxen, full of dressed animals going on all kinds of adventures. And in fact, later, Lewis would recount that he drew the dressed frog creature in homage to a particular British orator. Anyone want to take a guess? Churchill, yeah. But with a thick, permeating mist around the world of Littleley, we can only assume that this house was the inspiration for a certain professor's house that we're going to read about right before Christmas. Just a little lay of the land, what we're going to do over the next 5 weeks. We're going to be looking at the life and the contours of Lewis's thought. And on our final night together, your homework assignment is going to be to, between now and then, get started, at least get a good running start on reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then when we come back from Christmas break, sometime in February, hopefully we get the frozen tundra that is January behind us, maybe late February, we'll come back and we're going to look at Narnia in depth. We're going to look at what is the planetary code that Michael Ward has discovered for understanding Narnia. We're going to look at the Ransom series, or what some of you may refer to as the what? The Space Trilogy. That's actually my favorite. And I'm looking forward to the end here, hearing what are your favorites? Like, why are you here? What have you read that you just can't get enough of with Lewis? For me, I think maybe the most prophetic thing he's ever written is the Ransom series. And then we'll look at Mere Christianity. Also, I'll go ahead and say this. When we finish, I have a set of various first editions, many of them British first editions, that were in print in England when Lewis was alive. Some of them have come over from England, and I have some American first editions of the Chronicles of Narnia, a British first edition of the Silver Chair, which is probably the holy grail of my entire library, but y'all can check those out. Those aren't for sale. These are for sale. I just want to put that out there, okay? But the thick mist that permeated the atmosphere around Littleley would set the stage for that professor's house that we read about in the Chronicles of Narnia. He was surrounded, Lewis says, as a child, by a steady rain falling so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains nor the woods nor even the stream in the garden. However, Jack would see from time to time the woods and the hills that lay beyond Little Lay, and something would start to emerge in his young soul. Something began to come to life inside of him. The Castlereagh Hills that lie beyond the horizon of Little Lay would stir within him a sense of longing. And he didn't quite know as a little boy, he didn't know what to do with this sense of desire, this sense of longing. Later in 1933 in Pilgrim's Regress, have you read Pilgrim's Regress? And that's not to be confused with John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but Pilgrim's Regress is oftentimes one of the things when you talk to folks who are interested in Lewis, they haven't really come across that, and they've not read it, but it's very telling. In Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis, then a convert to Christianity, which is not going to happen tonight, but then a convert to Christianity, he would write about these hills as a symbol that remained with him for the rest of his life of this unknown, really ineffable desire. He thought he could hear, he said, the horns of Elfland in these hills, but perhaps one of the most charming instances of this emergence of desire can only be told by Jack himself, reflecting in surprise by joy. This is one of his main works that give us an insight into his heart. I actually have an American first edition of Surprised by Joy, and we're going to talk a little bit later in our study over the next few weeks about the discovery of Lewis in America. How did Lewis come to America? Not literally, but what was the impact of Lewis in America? And we'll be talking about how he answered every letter that came to him from children, both on that side and this side of the Atlantic. Every child that wrote to him, he would answer their letters. But he says in Surprised by Joy, which is one of the texts, people have said, well, David, so that we can really understand what's going on in this class, what are the things you would have us read? I mean, the variegation of I started to say Luther's writings, I've got Reformation in my mind, of Lewis's writings is vast. And so there's really, where do you begin and where do you end? But I think if you want to get the most out of these 5 weeks, I would say pick up Surprised by Joy, Grief Observed, Language in a Wardrobe, if you don't have that already, and The Weight of Glory, because The Weight of Glory is going to give us some insight into the contours of his thinking that is not what maybe some of us are most interested in or familiar with Lewis, namely his children's stories or the Ransom series, etc. So those would be the ones. Otherwise, I think Ken would probably tell you, why stop there? Just pick up one of everything. But in Surprised by Joy, which gives us the shape of his early life, and the impact of this idea of joy is crucial. In fact, the title of our study over these next 5 weeks is The Pursuit of Joy. And I intend that as sort of a quad entendre because Lewis, as we're about to see, has this longing within him for joy. Even as a little boy, he sees it when he looks at the hills. He has this desire, this awakening of joy, and he later comes to discover that it is joy that is pursuing him. He's longing for joy, but that same joy, and the only source of that joy, Jesus Christ, is pursuing him. Later in life, there's going to be a lady named Joy who's going to pursue him. And then he's going to pick up what she's putting down, and he's going to pursue joy. And so this idea of the pursuit of joy really is kind of a quad entendre, but he says here, reflecting back on his early life, listen to this. This is simply beautiful. I do not think any of the surviving drawings, the drawings that we were looking at here a second ago, these dressed animals, they called them. That's what they said, a world of dressed animals. He says, I don't think any of the surviving drawings date from the first 6 years of my life, which I am now describing, but I have plenty of them that cannot be much later. So probably when he was 7 or 8 or 9. From them, it appears to me that I had the better talent. In other words, I was a better artist than Morny. From a very early age, I could draw movement, figures that looked as if they were really running or fighting, and the perspective is good, but nowhere, either in my brother's work or my own, is there a single line drawn in obedience to an idea, however crude, of beauty. There is action, comedy, invention, but there is not even the germ of a feeling for design, and there is a shocking ignorance of natural form. Trees appear as balls of cotton wool stuck on posts, and there is nothing to show that either of us knew the shape of any leaf in the garden where we played almost daily. This absence of beauty, now that I come to think of it, is characteristic of our childhood. That's a very telling statement. What has he said so far? Our drawings had comedy and action and adventure, but the things that we drew didn't reflect the beauty in the world around us. And that absence of beauty, now that I come to think of it, is characteristic of our childhood. In some ways, that statement is going to set the trajectory for the rest of our hour. No pictures on the wall of my father's house ever attracted, indeed none ever deserved, our attention. We never saw a beautiful building, nor imagined that a building could be beautiful. My earliest aesthetic experiences, if indeed they were aesthetic, were not of that kind. They were already incurably romantic, not formal. What's he saying there? His desire for and understanding and experience of beauty was something that was kind of an ineffable, an unspeakable urging within him. He wasn't able to look around at the world that his father had created for them to see anything that was aesthetically appealing, that would train him to desire beauty or recognize beauty, and yet he couldn't escape it. And I would say his apologetic would say, neither can you and I, because we are created in the image of infinite, perfect, personal, or dare I say, tri-personal beauty. But that's what he had as a little boy. Once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin. Now, I would suggest to you the reason that you're here tonight, because you love C.S. Lewis, in many ways is because of an old biscuit tin. We don't talk about biscuit tins, right? But a biscuit tin. That's really why we're here tonight. It's a very English thing, like digestibles, but it's this biscuit tin that has us here. My brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did. It made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, not as a formal thing, he's saying, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. And so this idea of beauty for him was less than formal. It was, dare I say it, romantic. It was something that was quite existential. I do not think the impression was very important at the moment, but it soon became important in memory. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden. And every day there were what we called the green hills. That is the low line of the Castlereagh Hills, which we saw from the nursery windows. They were not very far off, but they were to children quite unattainable. They taught me longing. Sehnsucht made me, for good or ill, and what we called the Green Hills, that is the low line of the Castlereagh Hills, which we saw from these nursery windows, it made me long, he says, before I was 6 years old, for the votary of the blue flower. What's he saying there? What is Sehnsucht? Sehnsucht, the inconsolable longing in the human heart for something far off and indefinable, a high degree of intense recurring desire for something, particularly when its attainment is uncertain. Now this isn't just the sort of, how would I say it, immature ramblings of a young boy who was dissatisfied with his home life. This is something that by design all of us should be able to connect with, because by virtue of being created imago Dei, you are designed for desire. You are welcome to want. You were crafted by the triune God to crave. The question is, what do we want? What do we desire? What do we crave, and why? And is there something, or better, someone who can meet that craving, that longing, that desire? Sehnsucht is a German word. This is poet Matthew Arnold's wistful, soft, tearful longing, a desire or longing, just the sense of which is itself deeply satisfying. And this is important to sort of get our head and our heart around when it comes to understanding Lewis, this idea that joy, that desire itself, not even the object of desire, but the experience of desire is itself deeply satisfying, though, as we are going to discover, can be quite fleeting, because as soon as it comes, it goes, leaving one wishing they could feel the thrill of desire or even the sorrow of longing again. The Blue Flower is the stuff of German romantic writers such as Novalis, 1772 to 1801, and Joseph von Eichendorff, 1788 to 1857. They spoke of the same thing, only with a sense that the longing cannot be attained in the present life. Jack would later say in Dahmer, and this is around 1950, from at least the age of 6, romantic longing. And he doesn't by that mean like between a man and a woman, or a boy and a girl having a crush on each other. Romantic longing. Think of romance literature here. From at least the age of 6, romantic longing, Sehnsucht, had played an unusually central part in my experience. Such longing is in itself the very reverse of wishful thinking. It is more like thoughtful wishing, but it throws off what may be called systems of imagery. And so what he's saying here is that there is just this kind of undefinable, indescribable quality to this uniquely human experience of desire and longing. All this boyish drawing and dreaming lasted only a month at Little A, as Albert, a well-intended but emotionally distant father, decided it would be best to send Warnie off to boarding school. He was the oldest, and it was good to give him a leg up and set him up for competition so he could make his way in the world. And off he goes to boarding school. This left a lonely Jack without his best friend and creative partner. And this distance would define the next few years of their relationship. And this takes us back to the beginning of our story tonight. Books. Y'all know I love them. But I don't think any of us loved books the way that Lewis loved books. Books became Jack's friends. You ever feel that way? I was talking to somebody the other day, and we had just gotten a cup of coffee in the morning. I said, man, I can't not have it. And he said to me, he held up his cup of coffee. He said, it's like a friend, isn't it? And it really is. But for how many of you is there, think back to your childhood, was there a book in your childhood that was your friend? What was your friend? What book was your friend?
Actually, the Narnia books.
The Narnia books. Good answer.
Great.
That's like Jesus in Sunday school, isn't it? But good answer.
That's why I'm here.
That's why you're here. We're glad you're here. Anybody else, is there a book that was a childhood friend? Little House on the Prairie. Yes, Amy. Anne of Green Gables. Yeah, Will.
Spiderwick Chronicles.
The Spiderwick Chronicles. So Diane used to read stories to the kids every night. And she read, everything from the Harry Potter series, the Mysterious Benedict Society, all of these series that she took the kids through when they were little. And we had a dog at the time. He was part lab and part border collie. His name was Zeke. Zeke Cole Filson, because he was black as coal. But he loved nothing more. As soon as she would say, it's story time, off he would go, and he would run into the bedroom, get on Luke's bed, curl up, and just wait on Diane and the kids to get in there. He loved story time. What he did not like were Marvel movies because of the explosions and all that, and he would make his way to the back. Zeke was a romantic at heart. Zeke understood this idea of Sehnsucht. But this takes us back to the beginning of our story. Books became Jack's friends. They were piled high in every room. as he said, bulging shelves stacked on the stairs in the attic, everywhere. And this Sehnsucht, this sense of longing, of desire, will continue to manifest itself in young Jack's life. He one time recalled the story of his window being raised, and the aroma of a currant bush outside the window, firing his earliest memories at the old house. And there was a sense of longing for the old house, a desire he couldn't quite define. And the best way that he knew to describe it, remember he had read Milton's Paradise Lost by age 10, was to describe it the way that Milton wrote of the enormous bliss of Eden. So this was a man who felt deeply. He smelled this bush outside the window, and the only way that he could describe it, even as a little boy, was using the language of Milton. This smells like the enormous bliss of Eden. Are you starting to pick up what Jack is putting down, the way that these things will find their way into everything from the weight of glory? Right? The Lord finds our desires not too big but too small. We are half-hearted creatures, you and I, fooling about with food and sex and ambition, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in the ghetto, not knowing what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. In many ways, what C.S. Lewis's message to all of us is that we should not settle. We should not settle. If he were alive today, he would say, don't settle for just piecing out and doom scrolling and anesthetizing your heart. What Lewis is going to call us to over the next few Thursday nights is a heart fully awakened. In fact, that quotation, which is from the first page of The Weight of Glory, I'll show you in a couple of weeks a picture of me at the foot of the pulpit where he preached that at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. But in that quotation about the mud pies in the ghetto and a holiday at the sea, the context of that is actually him saying that this idea that as Christians we are to be unhappy has more to do with Kant and the Stoics and is no part of the New Testament Gospels. If we read the unblushing promises of the New Testament Gospels and the unblushing nature of those rewards held out to us, we would find that our desires are not too strong, but too weak. And that's when he says, because we're half-hearted creatures. As a little child, there was something in him not satisfied with half-heartedness. Again, he was very, very precocious, but this sort of high horsepower mind of his was in no way detached from this romantic sense of longing. This sense of desire would come and quickly go, leaving him grasping for an answer to which he could only tell himself as a little boy, Julian Potho, oh, I desire too much. Right? There's a tension there. How can this little boy who is so in touch with this human longing, this sense for something beyond the Castlereagh Hills, and yet life just takes over, and maybe what he needs to tell himself is, look, I just need to tamp this down. You know, Julian Potho, I desire too much. 1903, he pored over the pages, you're going to love this, of Beatrice Potter's books, particularly Squirrel Nutkin. It gave him another experience of this longing, this idea, he said, of autumn. Any of you like Potter in here? I know somebody does. Of course, one can't possess autumn, it says, but he would return to this little book over and over again just to capture this longing. I wonder, are any of you in here, some of these books that you talk about being your friends when you were little, Potter or Beatrice or Harry, Narnia, Anne of Green Gables, do you ever return to those books even as a bedraggled adult? You just return to those things. For me, when I was little, it was the Paddington Bear stories. Remember Paddington Bear? And Uncle Wiggily. Does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about? The Uncle Wiggily stories. All right, see there? Uncle Wiggily, Paddington Bear. And if you were to come up to, so this is the Hobbit hole back here. Y'all can roam around back there at your own risk. But This is the Hobbit hole. This is where all the theology and philosophy and apologetics are. Up in the other study that I have up there. Well, my library is spread all around. It's spread. There are various geographic locales for the whole of my library, but all of my literature, some of it's back here too, never mind. But most of my literature collection is up in my study at the church. And I can neither confirm nor deny that you might find Uncle Wiggily and Paddington Bear in there. But you know what I'm saying? We return to these books that are so special to us when we were kids. But why? Is it just nostalgia? No. Lewis would say it's Sehnsucht. It's this sense of the desire that was being awakened in you. A third glimpse into this idea of Sehnsucht for Lewis is when he read William Wordsworth Longfellow's Saga of King Olaf, which contained an unrhymed translation of a Swedish poet Esaias Tegner's 1782 to 1846 drapa. I heard a voice that cried, "Balder the beautiful is dead, is dead." He says, "I knew nothing about Balder, but instantly I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described, except that it is cold, spacious, severe, pale, and remote. And then, as in the other examples, found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing it were back again. A currant bush, squirrel nutkin, the idea of autumn, and this piece of poetry, and he doesn't even know anything about Balder, but just the way that it is laid out. Balder the beautiful is dead, is dead. The reader, he says, who finds these 3 episodes of no interest, need read this book no further. This isn't Surprised by Joy. And so he's saying, if you're wanting to get to know me, and that's why you're reading this book, The Shape of My Early Life, Surprised by Joy, if you're wanting to get to know me, and this is, you're checking out already because I'm talking about Squirrel Nutkin, you should just put the book down. For in a sense, the central story of my life is about nothing else. For those who are still disposed to proceed, I will only underline the quality common to the 3 experiences. It is that of an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. Let me read that again. That may be the most central and programmatic statement for understanding C.S. Lewis and the Pursuit of Joy. Let me say it again. This idea of Sehnsucht. I find myself at the very moment with this desire, already falling out of that desire and wishing it would come back. He says, I call it joy. Or let me back up here. He says, for those who aren't interested in what I'm saying so far, you don't need to read this book any further. This is a central story of my life. It's about nothing else. For those who are still disposed to proceed, I will only underline the quality common to the 3 experiences. It is that of an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and from pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has indeed one characteristic and one only in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Have you ever been there? Now, so you know, Lewis is squarely positioned in the Christian tradition, even as a little boy, and he doesn't know it. St. Aurelius Augustine, 354 to 430, Confessions 1:1. O Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Or Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 58, where he speaks of Jesus being the cream of all our pleasures. Have you ever thought about Jesus that way? Jesus, the cream of all our pleasures. So young Jaxie is a theologian and doesn't doesn't even know it. I call it joy, which is here a technical term. It's not happiness. It's distinct from pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has indeed one characteristic and one only in common with them, the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, and considered only in its quality, it might almost equally well be called a particular kind of unhappiness or grief. What do you think he means there? The longing is so intense that while it is joy, have you ever loved someone or something so much that it hurts? That's what he's getting at. It's almost like a kind of unhappiness or grief. But then it is a kind that we want. I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world. Again, we're half-hearted. We fool about with, food and sex and ambition. We settle. We want joy. We want Sehnsucht. But we settle for far less. He is wanting for the rest of his life, and it's beginning here. Though he's going to go, as we're going to see, through a period of atheism, his whole program is going to be to call us to get in touch with this sense of longing, this sense of desire. I doubt whether anyone who's tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world, but then joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is. But then joy is never in our power, but pleasure often is. I cannot be absolutely sure whether the things I have just been speaking of happened before or after the great loss which befell our family, into which I must now turn. There came a night when I was ill and crying, both with headache and toothache, and distressed because my mother did not come to me. That was because she was ill too. And what was odd was that there were several doctors in her room, and voices and comings and goings all over the house, and doors shutting and opening. It seemed to last for hours. And then my father, in tears, came into my room and began to try to convey to my terrified mind things it had never conceived before. It was in fact cancer, and followed the usual course, an operation. They operated in the patient's house in those days, and apparent convalescence. This was early 1908. Flora was diagnosed with abdominal cancer. Jack lived from that moment in unutterable fear and dread. Where was Warnie? He was at boarding school. His father was emotionally distant. He lacked the emotional IQ and EQ to help. And by August of that year, Warnie was summoned home as it was clear that Flora was dying. Neither boy knew how to process their mother's gaunt, gray pallor, the frailty, her delirium as the morphine would take over. They didn't know how to make sense of this. Lewis said our whole existence changed into something alien and menacing as the house became full of strange smells and midnight noises and sinister whispered conversations. Imagine this little boy. Imagine this little boy. This intense, unutterable desire for desire. This intense, unutterable longing for longing. And he had no one really to help him articulate that or explain where that comes from as a little boy created in the image of God. Little boys and little girls need us to remind them of what it means to be human. A couple of weeks ago in Biscuits and Bibles, we have everybody in there from guys in their 80s all the way down to, how old is Josiah? 8. And Josiah, who's there every Wednesday morning, asked me, Pastor David, he said, why does Satan hate us so much? Why does he hate me so much? There he is over there playing. Why does Satan hate me so much? I said, because Satan hates the King, the Lord Jesus. And the Lord Jesus has made of you a prince. And that's why he hates you. Lewis had no one, Jaxie had no one to help him make sense of the the smells and the sounds and these sinister whispered conversations. Lewis said her death, really, as far as he and Warnie were concerned, it took her from them, and as a bad result, it created a chasm between them and their father. And that's going to become a major feature for the rest of our story tonight. He said his father, listen to this, Albert was losing his wife. She died on his 45th birthday, y'all. And he was losing his sons at that moment and didn't even realize it. As Jack and Warnie became more and more dependent on one another, Lewis would write, page 19 of Surprised by Joy, everything that made the house a home had failed us. Everything except each other. We drew daily closer together. That was the one good result. Two frightened urchins huddled together for warmth in a bleak world. Lewis would later say of Warnie, and this picture here is actually taken from August of 2008, the month that their mom died, and they were out riding their bicycle. Lewis would later say of Warnie, he never seemed to be an elder brother. We were allies, not to say Confederates, from the very first. The sheer shock of viewing his mother's lifeless body in the coffin was something he could never unsee. He goes on to say, my mother's death was the occasion of what some, but not I, might regard as my first religious experience. When her case was pronounced hopeless, I remembered what I had been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted. I accordingly set myself to produce by willpower a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful. And as I thought, I achieved it. When, nevertheless, she died, I shifted my ground and worked myself into a belief that there was to be a miracle. The interesting thing is that my disappointment produced no results beyond itself. The thing hadn't worked, but I was used to things not working, and I thought no more about it. I think the truth is that the belief into which I had hypnotized myself was itself too irreligious for its failure to cause any religious revolution. I had approached God, or my idea of God, without love, without awe, even without fear. He was, in my mental picture of this miracle, to appear neither as Savior nor as Judge, but merely as a magician. Hang on to that word. If you know, you know. And when he had done what was required of him, I suppose he could just simply, go away. It never crossed my mind that the tremendous contact which I had solicited should have any consequences beyond restoring the status quo. I imagine that a faith of this kind is often generated in children, that its disappointment is of no religious importance, just as the things believed in, if they could happen and be only as the child pictures them, would be of no religious importance either. With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. We'll jump ahead just as a precursor of what we'll consider, Lord willing, next semester after the turn of the year. Mabel Kirk is Diggory's mother, as you know. And Aunt Lucy and Uncle Andrew's sister. She and Diggory move in with the Ketterleys because she's very, very sick. And her husband is working in India. And she actually doesn't appear until the end of the story, when Diggory brings her a healing Narnian apple. And she actually recovers when she bites that apple. And she delights in songs and games with Diggory and Polly. And she later moves back to the countryside with Diggory and Mr. Kirk. Don't you think that when Lewis wrote Magician's Nephew, he was writing out of this Sehnsucht that his own mother Flora could have been cured and danced and played games and frolicked with him in the fields? You know, we think, well, this is just the tender fragility of a little boy. It was just a decade ago, some of you walked me through it, where I prayed and prayed and prayed like I've never prayed before, that my own mother's cancer would just at least go into remission. But it didn't. And so when we read these things, the reason that we love Narnia now is more than nostalgia. There is something in us that longs and desires and knows that death is not the way it's supposed to be. Is there anyone who can do anything about it? Is there anyone who can do anything about death? I mean, after all, even Aslan himself had to succumb to death. But there's a rumor, right, that he came back with thicker fur. And he just seemed bigger. You know, Lucy and Susan, you just seem so much bigger. And he says, you better plug your ears. I'm about to roar. But please, please, can't you give me something that will cure Mother? Up till then, he had been looking at the lion's great feet and the huge claws on them. Now in his despair, he looked up at his face. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life, for the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than even he was himself. My son, said Aslan, I know. Grief is great. Only you and I in this land know that yet. But let us be good to one another. Now, I've spent considerable time tonight on Lewis's early life as the contours and the trajectories of his thought were set here. But I want to say something about Albert, this emotionally distant, low IQ, EQ, emotionally speaking father. He deserves a little understanding. His own father, Richard, died a few months prior to Flora. Again, she died on his birthday. And then his brother Joseph died a few weeks after Flora died. And now he just didn't know what to do with two devastated little urchins, as Lewis described himself, one a preteen and other a teen. Thinking it best, he sent both boys back to Warney's boarding school, Wynard. Jack called it Belsen. In fact, in Surprised by Joy, the chapter that he describes his time at Belsen is called Concentration Camp. If you know anything about Belsen, you know your history, you know Bergen-Belsen was a Nazi concentration camp wherein some 50,000 Jews, Poles, Czechs, same-sex attracted people, anti-Nazi Christians, Roma and Sinti gypsies were put to death. You don't want to view images from this camp after the British arrived to see the horrors unspeakable. I think it may be Belsen from which some of the most terrifying, truly horrifying images from the concentration camps can be found. The Reverend Robert Capron was the head of Wynard. The boys called him Oldie, and they called his grown-up son Wee Wee. Capron was a good teacher. Lewis went more deeply into his Latin studies, begun by his mother, but Capron was brutal. He would eventually be dismissed because of his mental instability, but his treatment of the kids there was really unspeakable. If a boy became sick, he would consign him to this empty attic by himself so that he wouldn't be near the other boys. And you would just have to go up there scared and all alone in this attic. His insane outbursts of rage and anger, and he would only allow the boys to take a bath once a week. But while Jack was there, he felt for the first time in 2 years, you guessed it, Sehnsucht, joy, longing. There was a copy of The Bookman containing an ad for a book of illustrations by Arthur Rachman of Richard Wagner's Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. And this is Wynard here. And he found this book there, and actually it was a book that was an advertisement for this book that contained the illustrations, but this advertisement had some of the illustrations, and he just poured over them. And then Jack and Warnie were invited by their married adult cousin to come visit her in Dundrum near Dublin. And Lewis would recount, there on her drawing room table, I found the very book which had started the whole affair and which I had never dared to hope I should see. Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods, illustrated by Arthur Rachman. Now remember, he had just seen a little supplement in the back of the Bookman, like a little advertisement, like a book catalog advertisement. He goes to his married adult cousin's house near Dublin, and lo and behold, she has the book. Lewis says, his pictures, which seemed to me then to be the very music made visible, plunged me a few fathoms deeper into my delight. I have seldom coveted anything as I coveted that book. And when I heard that there was a cheaper edition at 15 shillings, though the sum was to me almost mythological, I knew I could never rest till it was mine. I got it in the end, largely because my brother went shares with me. Purely through kindness, as I now see, and then more than half suspected, for he was not enslaved by the northernness, by this wistful desire, this longing, this Sehnsucht. With a generosity which I was enslaved by the northernness, which I was then even half ashamed to accept, he sank in what must have become to him a mere picture book, 7 and 6 pence, for which he knew a dozen better uses. Although this affair will already seem to some readers undeserving the space I have given it, I cannot continue my story at all without noting some of its bearing on the rest of my life. In other words, what Lewis is saying, if you want to understand Lewis, understand me as a little boy and the inner workings of my broken heart. Lewis goes on to tell how his growing doubts about Christianity, after all, praying for Flora didn't help. His growing doubts were being replaced by what he could really believe in, the northernness, desire, longing. That's something that has never left me. Ultimately, I keep coming back to it. That must be real. Myth, northernness, the Norse myths, the legends that I'm reading. Surely, this trajectory toward atheism has now begun. After Capern's insanity was evident, he was removed, but Albert went ahead and sent the boys to Campbell College in Belfast for 1 semester, then back to England. Warnie went to Malvern College, and Jack went to Sherborne House, where he lost his childhood belief in Christianity entirely under the tutelage of school matron Miss G.E. Cowie, whose theosophy, Rosicrucianism, spiritualism, and occultism, he said, quote, loosened the whole framework, blunted all the sharp edges of my prior childhood Christian belief. The whole thing became a matter of speculation. I was soon altering, I believe, with, well, one does feel. Warnie and Jack would next come under the private tutelage of W.T. Kirkpatrick, a former Presbyterian minister turned atheist. The Great Knock, they called him. He was a hard man, unrelenting, but Jack liked him. He learned Greek, and he learned that all beliefs, from Boxen and dressed animals to Norse legends to Christianity, were just man's inventions, mere myths. Writing to his dear friend Arthur Greeves on October 12, 1916, Jack admitted, I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention. And we have this man to thank, the Great Knock. Lewis said that his wife never could speak to him, save only saying in quiet tones, yes, Papa, no, Papa. Well, as we draw nigh to the end of our story for this evening, Lewis eventually enrolled as a student at Oxford on December 4th, 1916. He wrote again to his friend Arthur Greeves. This is Lewis here. He wrote to his friend Arthur Greeves, with whom he maintained correspondence. I have all the letters back here. That there were signs of war all around. Many of the student body were already on the front. There were only 315 students in all of the Oxford colleges. 50 from Asia, 25 refugees, 30 medical students, and some 120 officers training corps. Lewis was one of only 6 men in his college, University College. He studied the classics. He quickly made friends with one Edward Francis Courtney Paddy Moore. He became close with Patty's family, his mother, a divorcee, 45-year-old Mrs. Moore, and their 12-year-old daughter. Patty and Jack made a promise that when they went into service, if one of them did not return, the other would see after Mrs. Moore or Albert, Jack's dad. By October 17, Patty went to France with the Rifle Brigade. Warney was already in France with the British Expeditionary Force. Lewis joined his regiment on Crown Hill, and a month later, the 3rd Somerset Light Infantry went to the French trenches on his 19th birthday, November 29, 1917. French fever sent him to the hospital of La Trapore the following February. It was around this time that some believe to have been the beginnings of feelings on 19-year-old Jack's part for Mrs. Moore. Perhaps, given her age at this time, in her mid-40s, a longing for his greatest loss to that point when he was a 10-year-old boy peering into a hopeless casket. February 28, 1918, at Fonpeau, during the final German assault on the Western Front, Jack was wounded at the Battle of Arras on Mount Brénicon on April 15th. He wrote to his father that he was wounded on the back of his left hand, left leg from behind, just above the knee, and under his left arm. He would carry shrapnel in his chest for the rest of his life until near the end of his life, when it became so painful that they had to surgically remove it. Warney was so worried when he heard about it that he rode a bicycle 50 miles from Delaune to Etaples to check on him. Lewis was invalided at Edsley Palace Hospital in London on May 25th, 1918. Albert, despite being urged to do so, never went to visit his son. Mrs. Moore, on the other hand, was a frequent visitor. Patty, her son, was last seen on March 24th defending against the German onslaught. By September, Mrs. Moore received word he was dead. So she sent a letter to Albert Lewis. They tell me Patty was taken prisoner, but overthrew his guards, got back to our lines to be sent over again, was wounded in the leg, and his man was bandaging him up, and while he was bandaging him up, Patty was shot through the head and instantly killed. I had built up so much hopes on my only son, and they are buried with so many others in that wretched Somme. Jack has been good to me. My poor son asked him to look after me if he did not come back. We'll see more of Mrs. Moore's manipulative manner as the story continues. A very real possibility exists that her eventually barely tolerable presence in the kilns, where she eventually lived with Warney and Lewis in Oxford, that her intolerable behavior and just maniacal manipulative control would be the inspiration for a primary character in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who turns everything to winter and tempts little boys with Turkish delight. And yet, long after Jack became a Christian, and any hint of improper romantic entanglement between them was long in the past, still he allowed her to live with him and Warney at the kilns, and even paid for her lodging at a nursing home at the end of her life, her food and board, every need she had. He took care of it. This was Mrs. Moore's bedroom, and it got to a point where she was so intolerable. Lewis's bedroom was on the other side of this wall right here, and there was a door. But it got to where anywhere he went in the rest of the kilns, he would never go through this room because she just was so impossible to deal with. There's a set of stairs on the outside wall of his room that he would go up and down. I'll show you pictures of those. But when she passed, this room became the room wherein he would write about a white witch who turns everything into winter. This is the room in which we would all enter an enchanting new world, as he penned these opening words. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. That's me holding forth in Lewis's drawing room where he and the Inklings would gather if they weren't gathering at the Bird and Baby or the Eagle and Child. And they would gather here at the Kilns at Lewis's house, and they would drink their pint, they would drink their tea, and they would smoke their pipes and cigarettes and cigars. The tour guide thought he had one on us, but my wife was there. He said, "Can any of you look around this room and tell me anything that is not original to the room?" My wife immediately said, "The ashtray." Shocked, he was, you're right. "How did you know that?" And she said, "I'm with him." She said, "Because Warnie and Jack and Hugo Dyson and another one you might have heard of, J.R.R. Tolkien, knew that when they came in here, they were to flick their cigarette ashes and dump out their pipe ashes onto the carpet and grind them in with their feet, because Lewis and Warnie sincerely believed that would keep the moths away." They eventually brought in a housekeeper who came, and there was so much soot from their pipes on the blinds, on the windows, that when she put water on it to try to wash it off, the blinds literally disintegrated. They were a couple of bachelors, right? Jack would make good on his promise to look after Mrs. Moore. He also made good on a promise to himself to become a poet. All of that childhood love of romance literature was calling his name. He carried a little notebook with him when he was on the front and wrote wherever, whenever he could. He wanted to be a poet, and so he wrote atheist verse about a phantom he called Good, with a capital G. This material is known as the War Poems of C.S. Lewis. I have them back here. His increasing rejection of Christianity is available to be read, as these poems were collected with his writings under the tutelage of the great Knock that I showed you a minute ago, atheist Mr. Kirkpatrick. At age 20, he became a published author, March 1919, Spirits in Bondage, a cycle of lyrics. This is atheistic poetry. After he was released, Lewis returned to Oxford, January 13, 1919. So he takes care of his new family, moved mother and daughter into the house with him. They actually moved 8 different times between 1919 and 23. He called this his family. Warnie wrote to Albert, his father, complaining of the, quote, freakishness of it. Albert replied, quote, "If Jax were not an impetuous, kind-hearted creature who could be cajoled by any woman who has been through the mill, I should not be so uneasy. Then there is the husband," right? She's separated, divorced now from her husband. "Then there is the husband, whom I've always been told is a scoundrel, but the absent are always to blame." The rift between father and son intensified. Jack disliked visiting Belfast. This was now his family. It was now a great expense, but he worked to provide. In his 1922-27 diary, All My Road Before Me, Jack wrote of his, quote, rage against poverty, and was so exhausted from his studies that he pondered the pleasures of death. He also records that he was passed over at Oxford for many fellowships and acknowledged that apart from his father's generosity, he couldn't have continued studying there. But his exhaustion was well earned. He placed first-class degree in classical honor moderations in April 1920, a first in literature humaniores, or the greats, in August 1922, and a first in English in July 1923. He deputized for his philosophy tutor. He's basically a teaching assistant. For his philosophy tutor, E.F. Carrot, 1925. He was elected to a fellowship in English at Magdalen College, given room 3 on staircase 3 of the new buildings. This aided the financial dependence on his father and eased their tension a bit. It also changed everything. He enjoyed the switch from philosophy to English, as the former was a lonely spot, as no one could understand what you were saying as a philosophy professor other than your fellow philosophy professors. The distance between Jack and Albert remained until his father began suffering from rheumatism. Jack urged him to come to Oxford and to spend time with him there. Summer of 1929, Albert was diagnosed with cancer. Cancer figures prominently in a book that we are going to consider in some detail. I have very many valuable books by Lewis, British first editions, but this is the one. This raggedy old purple trade paper edition A Grief Observed. The opening lines, no one ever told me grief felt so much like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. I yawn. I keep on swallowing. He goes on to say, people tell me, come now, it shan't be that bad. You have plenty of resources. Then he says, then all of that common sense, when a sudden jab of red-hot memory comes, all that common sense vanishes like a moth in the mouth of a furnace. Cancer becomes, dare I say it, programmatic for what he has to process from then on. Albert was diagnosed with cancer. Jack started spending as much time as possible in Belfast repairing their relationship. He later lamented and was appalled at how he had viewed his father all those years. He would later say, I treated my own father abominably, and no sin in my whole life now seems to be so serious. The idea of sin and of a solution to that sin would arrive as one night he took a walk with a couple of friends. This walk changed everything. This walk is really why you're here tonight. You know what happened on this walk? We'll come back next week and I'll tell you the story. So real quickly here, we have 10 minutes before it's time to go. Why are you here tonight? Why take time? We're entering one of the busiest seasons of the year. The holidays are coming. Why come to C.S. Lewis, The Pursuit of Joy? Yeah, Jeff. I'm going to bring the microphone over to you.
It is to experience the profound, life-changing experience of a towering intellect of our time and going into atheism and then coming back out.
Yeah.
And how that happened.
Yeah. Good. So the apologetic feature of Lewis's thought and life. Yeah. Anyone else? Why are you here? Why'd you make time to come? I told Diane, make sure we have enough cookies for maybe 20 people. It's better to have more than not enough, I told her. Yeah. I'm going to hand this back to you here so everyone can hear.
Well, Crossway had an audio book sale, and Campbell and I bought a bunch of them, and part of it was the 3-volume Lewis biographies.
Yeah.
And so I listened through them, and it's like total 1,100 pages.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow, I've never read this much about anybody.
Yeah.
And that was just after experiencing his other books, but not really knowing anything about his growing up. And so when I heard you were teaching this, I was like, I want to get together with other people who are interested in learning more.
And look at this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just fascinating. And thank you. You're bringing back to memory all the things I listened to, but
Yeah.
you lose so much. So thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. Anyone else? Why are you here? Why would you come to a study on Lewis? What is it? Will?
Well, as we head into Christmas, I am pondering the importance of joy and our Savior being incarnated and the cause for joy that is. And I kind of realized I don't have a very developed theology, I guess, of joy.
Mm-hmm.
How is it different from pleasure, like you alluded to earlier? And I figured C.S. Lewis would kind of be the one to walk us through that and kind of develop that understanding.
Yeah. My hope is that none of us are able to get through this study and not feel Sehnsucht and understand it, because Sehnsucht is not just a proposition; it really is a person. And I think you know who I'm talking about. Anyone else? Ingrid, why are you here? And I'm going to come to you.
Well,
Ingrid is back. I love it.
it's been a while. Well, I majored in English in college, and I gained a great appreciation for literature that I didn't have when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I loved Narnia growing up, so it's while I was home, what a perfect opportunity to dive more into it, so.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I had experiences of sane suit. And then when I heard the word a few months ago, it just kept coming up.
Like,
and
that's it.
oh, there's a word for it.
Yeah.
Other people have experienced the same thing, this
Yeah.
untouchable, like thin veil, where you
Mhm.
know there's something more. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I love it. Anyone else? A couple of others. Peggy, we're coming.
You just absolutely set my brain afire, as you usually do. Thank you. But I was just, I think something was said on your little piece or advertisement about that joy was after him.
Yeah,
And that was new for me.
Yeah.
I didn't realize about that. But even talking about all you've been talking about tonight, it brought back to my mind as a young child. I did not read.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't read at all.
You made up for that over the years.
Yes, I
Yeah.
have. The Lord gave me such a hunger. But I sang a lot.
Mm.
And let me tell you what the song was, and you're going to think, well, Peggy, that's not the same. It really was, because the song was Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
Uh-huh.
Bluebirds fly.
Yeah.
And in my soul, I was not saved,
Yeah.
but I loved that song. That just flooded my soul with such delight.
Yeah.
And I really believe that was the Lord was moved.
Yeah.
I really do.
I think you're right.
That was early. But of course, he moved later.
Yeah.
But I hadn't thought about that
Yeah.
being the same. Am I thinking right?
You are quite the theologian. You. Whether it's somewhere over the rainbow or the aroma of a currant bush,
Same.
right? Squirrel Nutkin and the idea of autumn. There is in every human breast this realization that we were made for more. And by virtue of being aware of ourselves, the only self one can be aware of is a self created in the image of the triune God. Every human being comes standard feature with a longing for home. And I think that's what Lewis is going to help us unpack. Virtually everything he wrote, whether it was something more prose-oriented, sermonic, The Weight of Glory, or a little children's story, is calling us home. And the reason that I said that this is kind of a quad entendre, he was pursuing joy, not aware that it was actually joy that was pursuing him. And it reminds me of Psalm 23:6, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. Some of you have heard me say this many times. But the word for follow in the Hebrew is yirad fani. It's from the Hebrew root radaf. Every time it is used of an enemy hounding down, chasing down someone. David says here, though, surely goodness and chesed, grace, shall yirad fani, chase me all the days of my life. And so the story of, now if you start crying, you know I'm going to cry. You know me. You know, if you start crying, I'm going to cry.
It just really touches me.
And so really the story of Lewis is the story of grace on the chase. We won't get into this until next semester. But the reason that for my birthday last year, I talked Diane into letting me get this. The silver chair is the first British edition silver chair. A friend of mine for many years is one of the top 10 probably Lewis scholars in the world, and he is also a purveyor of Lewis first editions, British first editions. And the story in there of Jill Pole at the stream, and she's dying of thirst, and there's Aslan across the way in front of the stream, and she just wants to go get a drink of that water, but she wants Aslan to step aside because he's a terrible lion with these huge claws. And she starts negotiating with him, and she says, would you mind stepping aside? Because he'd said, if you're thirsty, come and drink. And she said, would you step aside? Well, I do. And Lewis says, he answered that with only a low growl. And she said, do you eat little girls? And he said, I have consumed men and women, cities and entire realms. Do you promise not to do anything to me if I do come to the stream? And Aslan says, I make no such promise. And she says, I'm dying of thirst. And he said, well, come and drink. Well, if you don't, you're going to die of thirst. And she says, what? Well, I'll just go find another stream. And what does Aslan say? There is no other stream. And then Lewis says, before she knew it, it was the maddest thing she had ever done. But she was lapping up the cold water, and it was so satisfying. And she got up, not realizing that she had been drawn between his two forepaws. And it says, and I love this line, she got up with her lips still wet from the drinking. And so that's Jesus, right, drawing us, because our deepest desire. You think, well, David, that's just a leap on your part. Is it? John 17:39, on the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried in a loud voice, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. For as Scripture said, whoever believes in me, out of him will flow rivers of living water. Really, the central message of Lewis when it comes to Saint Suit is there is no other stream, is only Jesus. And that's what we're going to celebrate over the next few weeks as we get our hearts ready for Christmas. So just a couple of words before we leave. We've got wonderful books over here. There are some great biographies of Lewis. You may be thinking, David, what should I do? Because there are so many biographies of Lewis you can read. I would say if you read George Sayers' Jack, that's a good older biography. But the best biographies, I think, now I would steer away from A.N. Wilson's biography of Lewis, but I would suggest that you read The Narnian by Alan Jacobs, or Alistair McGrath, C.S. Lewis, an intellectual biography, or this new 3-volume set here by Harry Lee Poe, Becoming C.S. Lewis, The Making of C.S. Lewis, and the Completion of C.S. Lewis. This has now become the definitive biography if you want to read a lot, but then also I would say, again, Alan Jacobs, The Narnian, or Alistair McGrath's biography, also a good place to jump in if you want to fill in some of the gaps that for the sake of time, I can't cover all the details. Again, our trajectory is going to be tonight, next Thursday night, and then when we come back after Thanksgiving, that Thursday night, we're going to be looking at the story of Lewis. And it's worthy of 3 nights. And then we're going to look at the main contours of his thought. And then on the final night, we're going to enter the wardrobe and get our hearts ready for Christmas. Again, come look at the book table. Go get some digestibles on your way. I still think it's such a British thing, digestibles, but they're really good. So thank you all for coming. This is incredible. I can't really believe it turned out like this. Wow. Yeah, this is awesome. I thank you all for being here.